might concentrate on some actual work. Get Celeste in position for a handoff. You need to get the delivery to her. She'll be near the communications tower ahead of you.
For the past few years, I've been seeing a pattern within the FPS community. A pattern that echoes the older days of the competitive gaming scene where you had more fast-paced shooters like Quake or Unreal Tournament, and even Tribes if anyone remembers those games. They were known for smooth and fluid movement that also had a really high skill ceiling in order to play at a competitive level. But when games like Counter-Strike and Halo came into the fold, the genre as a whole saw a shift towards more slower paced and accessible games. And throughout the 2000s we would see this new pattern continue, and it seemed to be in it for the long haul, with only a few smaller games in between that reversed the clock to what was considered the golden age of the shooter genre. But in 2008, something unexpected had happened, and it was from a company that back then had been growing a worsening reputation over the coming years, a game that was completely different from what was being released at the time, especially in the shooter genre. That game was Mirror's Edge. Mirror's Edge was developed and published by EA and DICE, and it was a single-player focused game that took the off-beaten path instead of being another product that would only continue to saturate the existing market at the time. This off-beaten path would take a look at the world of parkour, a form of free running that was scalable to low-key obstacle courses, to dangerous urban areas, and for some, even across high buildings. For some though, it was an exhilarating form of extreme sports where people would risk injury for the sake of getting from point A to point B as fast as possible. Mirror's Edge is a game that takes that same concept and makes it its core gameplay, but in a more exaggerated manner, giving it a dystopian, brightly lit city full of bright reds, blues, yellows, and sometimes green. On the one hand, it was a risk, but on the other, it was an opportunity for DICE to test their creative juices into making a more innovative game, rather than just simply making another shooter like they had already done with the Battlefield games. And at the end of the day, it actually paid off. Mirror's Edge was one of the best games released in 2008, with the 360 and the PS3 owners enjoying the game, following a PC release the year after. It was a game that was all about movement and getting through the level as quick as possible, with some combat in between. It was a game that had stuck with me to this day, and I'd recently played it again for the first time in 9 years. And my opinion of the game back then hadn't changed. So let's get into the game itself and why it's my favorite EA DICE game. Now, when it comes to games like Mirror's Edge, you could make arguments that it wasn't the first game to be movement focused. After all, every shooter has a degree of movement. But if you want to dig a little bit more, you'll find some earlier examples of games sort of similar to Mirror's Edge. One example is Counter-Strike Surfing, a movement-based mode in the 2000s that exploited the game's physics by surfing along an angled object on large maps where the goal was to reach the fastest time possible. Or Quake 3 Defrag, a movement-based mod for Quake 3 Arena that focused on trick-shotting and moving as fast as possible on large maps. Both games encapsulated a euphoric feeling of movement that wasn't really anywhere else at the time. You could even say that these were the grandfathers of the first-person movement scene that we're familiar with today. But Mirror's Edge was the game with a mainstream company behind it, alongside a big budget to make the most polished project possible at the time, with hundreds of animations incorporated into the Unreal 3 engine, the engine that DICE had to use because the Frostbite engine, their own in-house engine, wasn't quite ready yet. It was also the game to incorporate a more unique form of movement based on the existing practice known as parkour, but within the template of a first-person shooter. So DICE combined parkour and FPS and blended it into a stylized and unique experience that is Mirror's Edge, with a story mode and challenge runs to get the fastest time possible. So, the story of the game is set in a city that had begun facing a series of laws and changes that eventually led to it being more of a utopian state. A city seemingly safe as long as you follow the rules to a T anyway. As more regulations were implemented, the old version of the city would be stamped out in favor of the new one, restructuring its society to something in favor of the new law movement. The citizenship program, that is. Many protested during an event known as the November Riots, and your character, Faith Connors, was but a child while your family suffered in the tragedy of it. The mother gone and the father and the two daughters are now left to pick up the pieces. Over time though, you would eventually leave and become a runner, a resistance group of people that run across the city, delivering packages to those that need it. With the existing government outlawing the practice, this makes you a target for the authorities, and the game starts you off back in action after sustaining an injury from your last run. This is the training mode that teaches you all of the core concepts needed in order to complete the game, and it will be a lot of trial and error. And the reason why is simple. The game's parkouring mechanics aren't that far apart from the concepts found in platformers, where precision is geared towards precise movements and controlled speeds in order to traverse an area efficiently without dying. One mishap could either send you to your death, or your jump wasn't high or far enough to reach that pipe or ladder or obstacle and you have to try it again. The training mode is merely a reminder of that you're going to make a lot of mistakes in this game, and at times it's going to be really frustrating. But when you pull off a sequence of jumps and slides and climbs, wall running and gaining speed without a single drop in momentum, it becomes one of the most blissful moments you'll ever experience in gaming, and it only encourages you to find even better ways to pull off even faster runs. With the training mode out of the way, you have your first job after recovering, and it's a relatively simple package pickup, at least until the authorities arrive anyways. You get out of there and then you call it a day. But the catalyst for the game's story begins when you hear of your sister responding to a call. Out of concern for her safety, you rush to find her, only for her to be in a tangled situation where the mayor candidate is killed and your sister is framed, thus beginning the pursuit for your sister's freedom in order to clear her name and to get to the bottom of what happened by running across buildings and tangoing with the game's main enemies, the PK private security soldiers. Now, the game is primarily a parkour-based movement game, but it does also feature combat, which is honestly the least interesting part about the game. While it's great to pull off a counterattack when timed right, the combat itself feels somewhat basic and very slow in comparison to the fast-paced side of the game's movement. Now, this was actually an intentional choice in the game's design. You can engage in the combat and take down the enemies, but it would also slow you down and break the game's momentum. And the thing is that you don't actually have to fight the enemies at all in this game. You can just run past them and find a way out of the arena most of the time. Now, in some scenarios, you may have to actually fight. In some scenarios, you may get told you'll have to go through them, but speedrunners and veteran players are always looking for a way to exploit the gameplay and the physics of Mirror's Edge in order to find the fastest routes and the fastest ways to get past each obstacle in the level. The game itself is actually quite short, lasting only a couple of hours of playtime, but the gameplay itself is so good and oddly relaxing that the game is quite replayable. Even with the linear designs of the level itself, there are so many different ways to traverse it, let alone the conditions that you can set on yourself, like say not using any guns or not fighting anyone at all. If I remember correctly, there was an achievement I managed to get on the 360 where you complete the game without firing a single weapon. Even for that last bit in the final level where you have to destroy the servers, there is a way to get it done. You just need to manipulate the firing of your enemies. The combat itself is quite optional, but the movement is where the primary focus is at and is the central core of Mirror's Edge. While the story or its characters aren't really anything special or memorable, I didn't mind Faith's character. Her design is great and her agility and flexibility gives her an edge when moving across the platforms or engaging in combat, being able to dart around the attacks of the enemies and even disarming them if necessary. There is background lore and story that you can find throughout the game, whether it's through the bags that you can find from other runners that have disappeared, or computer screens showing messages of other people talking about whatever it is. But the setting itself is one of the game's bigger highlights besides the gameplay. Usually, photorealistic games age worse over time as the technology improves, but Mirror's Edge still somewhat holds up really well, and it's because of its use of bright colors within the city, hiding a lot of the blurriness of the textures that you don't really notice it. You'll generally see a consistent pattern of those brightly lit colors, as well as the red colors that appear frequently, indicating where to jump or what objects you can jump onto or climb onto. This was designed to more or less guide players on where to go or where to jump. But as you continue playing the game, you'll learn to rely on it less as you discover more unique approaches to the level and as you memorize it further. And on the hard difficulty, the red vision is disabled entirely, therefore requiring your memory and awareness in order to complete the level. The choice of colors, as I said, hides a lot of the dated graphics, blending it into its own unique art style that still holds up really well and looks great. and it's a game from 2008. But the character models are another story, which haven't held up as well, which is to be expected given how old the game is now. While the setting and the city look great, I can't help but notice how lifeless the game is. On a technical note, I understand why. Having to render dozens of people on the screen at the time just wasn't feasible really, other than the occasional 3 or 4 people that you see on the ground when you fall to your death. But the only people that you interact with and see in the game are the other characters as well as the enemies themselves. The city otherwise just seems really empty. Other than that, its setting complements the gameplay and the level design that was structured around the concepts of parkour movement perfectly. Well, almost perfectly anyways, but close to perfect in my opinion. Earlier on, I spoke about trial and error. Mirror's Edge is one of those games where you're going to die a lot, and it's usually from platforming or sometimes just fucking up in combat. On the one hand, it's a precision issue, but on the other, it's also a matter of jank. The game has a fair bit of it, and it hasn't really quite aged as well as I thought upon playing it again. When the game works, it's fantastic, but when it doesn't, it's incredibly frustrating. Struggling to get across another pipe just because your character somehow decides to just jump past it instead, thus falling down to my death really, and it's just annoying when it happens, or when you fail to counterattack an enemy knowing that you've pressed it at the right time. The game is full of these annoyances that make it more frustrating than it should be as it continues to happen. Now I know that no game is ever going to be perfect and there's going to be mishaps from either you or the game, but it really does get irritating when you know that you're doing it right and the game decides otherwise. Without careful consideration of each action that you perform, it could end up being a deal breaker for you for this game, especially if you're one of those gamers that prefers to take their time with things. If you're one of those people, then this game isn't for you. Mirror's Edge is a game that's all about the green light and not stopping for anything. It was designed to be fast, and as such, the game rewards you for getting through it effortlessly in the movement department. Is the game easy? Not quite, but it's still pretty accessible given the fact that you have the runner's vision and the red colors to guide you on the right path. Hard mode is where it gives you the most challenge because the enemies do more damage and you have to keep a closer eye on where to jump or what platforms you can climb on, but at the end it's a short experience that's also replayable and has modes too where you can test your skills. Nowadays the gaming scene is chock full of games that prioritize freedom in movement. AAA games and indie games have movement-based modes and games centralized in movement alone. You have the Minecraft platforming scene, Counter-Strike surfing, Titanfall 2 Kraken matches, Quake Defrag, Apex Legends on its own, and many more. As for the games that are movement-based, well, you have Ghost Runner, Lovely Planet, Refunked, Cyberhook, Speedrunners from Hell, Neon White, and so many others, creating this whole new wave of first-person movement games that are all about speedrunning through a level in the most unique and quickest ways possible. Mirror's Edge was one of the earlier mainstream titles to bring forth a new style of first-person gameplay that still lingers on in the guise of many other games after it. The legacy of Mirror's Edge was born from a company that we would never have expected to have come from, EA and DICE. Mirror's Edge is my favorite DICE game because it provided a unique style of first-person gameplay with a dynamic range of animations and fluid movement. Its beautiful soundtrack composed by Solar Fields, who I'd recommend checking out. Its fantastic setting and use of graphics that blend into a distinctive art style of soulless white and bright colors, compounded with the game's great use of static daytime, lights and shadows. Mirror's Edge is one of those games that still ages quite well in spite of the fact that it was more of a photorealistic game, and as I said, the character models have aged a lot worse than the game's overall graphical presentation. But the main draw is that DICE created one of the most unique and fun games that I had ever played, and they haven't really made anything like it since, besides the sequel, which wasn't as good as the first one in my opinion. If you're looking to get into movement-based games, where it's more about said movement rather than just gunplay, then start here. Thank you for watching.